Today, we're diving into a topic that I believe hits home for a lot of pharmacists, especially for those who feel like despite making a good income, they should be further along with the financial plan. Maybe that's you. You got the degree, the stable job, the six-figure income. Perhaps you've been even at it for a while, but something doesn't quite add up. You're not making the progress you had hoped for. You feel constrained, maybe even a little bit frustrated, and you're wondering, what gives? Why is this the case? So in this episode, that's exactly what we're talking about today. I'm going to be unpacking 3 common culprits that I see time and time again in the lives of pharmacists that often lead to financial stagnation, that lead to that feeling of being stuck. Number 1 is a fixed mindset that can put a subconscious cap on what your potential is. The second is a fixed income that hasn't kept up with pace of inflation or perhaps ambitions that you have. And the third is the fixed costs that often eat away at our flexibility, at our options, at our monthly income. So a fixed mindset, a fixed income, and fixed costs. Now, this episode isn't just about cutting costs or finding another side hustle. It's about reframing the way that we think about money, about income, and about the possibility. Because if we're going to break free of feeling stuck, we have to address both the numbers and the narrative that we believe about those numbers. So let's jump in with our first area that's fixed often, and that's a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset. Many pharmacists, myself included, this has been my own journey as well. We adapted the belief starting in pharmacy school that as a pharmacist, you're going to make a great income. I remember this story. I graduated in 2008. I started in 2002. It was a direct entry 6-year PharmD program. And said or unsaid, the story was, hey, don't worry about the student loans. You're going to make a great income as a pharmacist. And for those that graduated around that time period, you'll remember this time period where we started to see shortly after the requirement of the PharmD degree, we saw that there was at the time a shortage of pharmacists. Salaries escalated at a significant pace or rate. There were sign-on bonuses, all types of offers that were happening. And so we early on believed this story of, hey, as a pharmacist, you're going to make a great income. And while pharmacists do make a good income, we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, this subconsciously can insert a ceiling in our minds of what's possible, right? When I graduated at the age of 24, $120,000 seemed like a big number. And it was at that point, right? Not having earned an income, coming out with a couple $100,000 of student loan debt. So it was a big number, but it was also and would become a ceiling in my mind of what was possible. In the book, The Big Leap, if you've never read it, I would highly recommend it. The author, Gay Hendricks, talks about this concept. He refers to it as an upper limit problem, described by an often unconscious, a subconscious tendency to sabotage our success and potential and to instead default and to choose what is comfortable. Let me say that again, because it's so important when we start to shift our mindset around money, the different areas in the financial plan can really start to move. So he calls this concept the upper limit problem, an often unconscious and often subconscious tendency to self-sabotage our success and potential and instead default and to choose what is comfortable, right? It's comfortable in our minds to think of a pharmacist that's working 40 hours a week and to be making $130,000 a year. And we should be grateful for that. It's a very common situation, but that's a comfortable scenario. It's perhaps uncomfortable if I were to say, hey, imagine a pharmacist that's making $250,000 or more, and heck, maybe they aren't even working 40 hours a week. Oh no, right? What do you mean they're not working 80 hours a week, picking up a bunch of shifts and overtime to make that kind of money? How is that even possible, right? And I'm not suggesting that that path is easy. I'm not suggesting that that path is for everyone that's out there, and it's probably not. Because often with that type of income potential comes some risk, depending on how we're getting to that number. But here's the thing. This is the point of that exercise. Notice the emotions. Just slow down for a moment. Notice the emotions that came up for you when you heard a pharmacist that's making $250,000 or more. Does that excite you? Does that make you feel uncomfortable? Does that scare you? Perhaps feelings of judgment, or of greed or of skepticism, maybe those came to the forefront. Really tuning into these feelings is important because as we get more aware of some of these money scripts that are in our mind, they can be an indicator perhaps as to where our own upper limit might be. So that's number one in terms of 3 reasons that I often see pharmacists are stuck. Number one is a fixed mindset. Number two is a fixed income, right? So speaking of an upper limit, let's talk about the trajectory of a pharmacist's income. Again, it is a good income. Let's not lose sight of the big picture here. But if that income stays relatively flat while expenses go up at a significant pace, which is often the case, especially for people in that first 10 years after graduating, the difference, also known as the discretionary income or the disposable income, that anything that's left over that we can fund our goals, such as paying down debt, saving and investing for the future, enjoying life, experiences giving, right? If our income stays relatively flat while those expenses, those demands rise, then the purchasing power of our income, the ability of our income to achieve what we wanted to achieve erodes over time. Okay, so let's look at some data to support this. For a point of reference, in 2014, a pharmacist was making, on average, and if you're curious, this data comes from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, $118,470 per year. Okay, so let's just call it $118,000 per year. That's in 2014. Fast forward 10 years later, 2024, that number was $137,210. Let's call that $137,000. So if you look at that 10-year difference, 118 to 137, you might look at that and say, hey, that's a pretty significant increase. What are you talking about in terms of a flat or fixed income, right? And just as a quick aside, if you've been working 10 plus years and those numbers that you just heard matches your salary trajectory, that is not a raise. I mean, technically it is because the number went up, right? But if we dig deeper, the story changes. Once we factor in inflation, now not every expense we have is subject to inflation. Think of something like a 30-year fixed rate mortgage as one example. But a lot of our expenses are, especially for people that maybe are in that middle point of their career. I think about my own situation. I've got 4 boys in our household, right? Obviously, expenses are rising in terms of food and activities and clothes and all the things. So a lot of those expenses are subject to inflation. So if we're stuck in this mindset of 120 or 130 or 140, it's more like a cost of living adjustment if we see incremental gains, especially if those don't outpace inflation. And it often, in many cases, they do not. So if your employer says, hey, you're doing a great job, you're a top valued employee, we're going to give you a 1.5%, 2% raise, right? We need to shift our mindset that may not even be enough in terms of a cost of living adjustment. And are you advocating for yourself, whether that be internally within your organization, or perhaps there's other opportunities to make sure that that value is compensated appropriately? We've talked about negotiation on this show before. We'll reference some of those episodes in the show note. So that's the second item, would be a fixed income, right? So we talked about the first area we talked about was a fixed mindset. The second area we talked about was a fixed income. The third reason that I often see pharmacists stuck financially, and let me reiterate, no judgment here. Many of these applied at one point in time in my own financial plan. The third reason is a large percentage of their take-home pay, which is the tool that we have to achieve our goals, going towards fixed costs. And often those fixed costs are over a long period of time, okay? So here's the thing, the financial plan is as simple and hard as living off of less than you make, regardless of what you make, so that you can allocate the difference to various goals, right? So if we make $120,000 based on our take-home pay, if we spend a majority of that take-home pay and we don't have a different amount to allocate to our goals, we're not going to make a whole lot of progress. If we can live off of less than we make, easier said than done, depending on where you live in the country, depending on what your household income is, and we can allocate and create some margin to allocate the difference to various goals, that's obviously where we're going to start to see progress with our goals, whether that's saving and investing, debt repayment, purchasing investment properties, whatever would be the various goals that you're working on. And so therefore, the percentage of your income that is earmarked towards your fixed costs means that we have less levers that we can pull to free up cash, right? So if 70% or 80%, hopefully not, But if that high of a percentage of your income is allocated toward fixed costs, even if you're making a good income, right, we don't have a whole lot of options of what we can do unless we can somehow change or offload one of those fixed costs. So the decision points here come before we make that decision on a large purchase, especially if it has a fixed cost. Now, what am I talking about when I say fixed costs, right? Because pharmacists, as I've made the case, despite their good income, in what I see, tend to have a large percentage of their income tied up in fixed costs, meaning that they, let's say, graduate in their mid to late 20s, they're making a great income, and then expenses rise, and all of a sudden we wake up, we're 10, 15, 20 years in our career, a large percentage of our income is tied up in fixed costs, and therefore we have this nagging feeling that, hey, we're kind of stuck, right? We're trading time for money, and we're not making the progress that we could or should be making financially. So let's take a closer look at what these fixed costs are. The most common ones that I see come in the form of a mortgage, student loan payments, daycare, childcare expenses, if you want to broaden that out, and car payments. Okay, those are the four that I see that have the most significant impact in terms of fixed costs and not feeling like someone has breathing room. Again, that's a mortgage, student loan payments, childcare expenses, and car payments. Let me give you some numbers here for a moment. If we assume that the median home price in the US is about $400,000, that's gone up recently, and obviously different parts of the country, that's more. Some it might be a little bit less. If we assume that the median home price in the US is about $400,000, that the average monthly car payment for a new car is about $700, actually has gone up a little bit as well. And the average student loan payment for a pharmacist on a 10-year repayment plan that has the average student loan debt, that'd be about $1,800 a month. Just in those three things, the mortgage, the car payment, and the student loans, we have a monthly total of those three fixed costs of about $5,300 per month. Okay, so over $5,000 per month. Now, if we look at the average pharmacist salary, I just mentioned some of that data. This would mean that based on that average salary, if we account for taxes and take-home pay, about 75% of that take-home pay is allocated in fixed costs. Right now, some people listening, you've got two incomes in the household, and you start to obviously distribute those fixed costs, right? Some may not be the case. Mortgage, you may have one mortgage payment, but you might have two student loans. You might have two car payments. So obviously everyone's situation is different. But again, let me reiterate that point. In that example I gave, which is a pretty standard example of a mortgage, a student loan payment, and a car payment, that's about 75% of a typical pharmacist take-home pay. So this is in part why someone can make a good income, like many pharmacists do, but they feel like, hey, I'm living paycheck to paycheck, or it feels like we're living paycheck to paycheck. So now the question is, as we look at those three areas, right, how do we begin to work through this? And yes, the natural shifting point is to focus on cutting fixed expenses, but it can be hard to really move the needle on those expenses for those that already have them in place, right? Again, think about a car payment over, let's say, a 5 to 7 year term, or a mortgage over a 30-year term would be the most common one. A student loan payment. There's some levers we could pull looking at income-driven repayment plans versus a fixed payment, but again, not a whole lot on that debt that's already accounted for. So some rocks are easier to maneuver than others, right? Again, we might be able to move some things with a student loan repayment, not so much when it comes to a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, or a common scenario, a car that's perhaps worth less than the outstanding balance that's due. And while cutting fixed expenses can be huge, absolutely can be, right? Because it would give us more margin every single month thereafter we make that decision. When that is paired with uncapping the ceiling on our income, remember our first fixed mindset that we talked about, that's where things really start to move, right? When we can look at both sides of the equation, how can we potentially uncap, increase the income, be intentional with how we allocate that income, do it in a tax efficient way, while also looking at, are there things that we might be able to do on the expense side of the equation? And I think we often focus, for good reason, on the expense side of the equation and not give credit to the other side of the equation, which can be just as important, if not more important, if we're able to increase the income potential. Now, as we said before, to uncap that ceiling on income, right, we have to focus on the story that we're telling ourselves about what is possible. And if you think that mindset is not a critical, foundational part of the financial plan, I would challenge you to think again. The story we tell ourselves, said or unsaid, about how we approach our money is the engine, often subconscious, but it's the engine behind the decisions that we make and what we believe is possible. So if you're listening to this episode today, if you're watching this episode and you have a nagging sense of, hey, Tim, I feel like I should be further along, whether you're in the middle of your career, approaching retirement, or perhaps just getting started in that first 5 to 10 year window, first thing I want you to know is that you are not alone in those feelings. I remember when I was going through my early stages of paying off a couple $100,000 of student loan debt back from 29 to 2012, 2013, right before I started the Your Financial Pharmacist blog, I felt like I was on an island. I thought to myself, hey, every other pharmacist must have this figured out. And that certainly, as I would come to find out, is far from the case. So you have to know that your story is not unique. You're not alone in the feelings of that. And there are other people in community that are here and around you to support you. Second, we would welcome the opportunity to talk with you. Many of you already know that at YFP, we have a team of fee-only certified financial planners that work with pharmacists virtually all across the country. From those that are getting ready to enter retirement to those that are just getting started. And we believe that in the one-on-one planning, comprehensively looking at all parts of the financial plan, that's where we can really have the most benefit. So if you're feeling that, hey, we could be progressing a little bit further than we are, or perhaps you might work with a planner currently and you're wondering, hey, is that the best fit? We would love to have the opportunity to talk, to learn more about your situation, and to share more about our services to see whether or not they're a good fit. You can schedule a discovery call with us by going to yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You'll see a link there to book a discovery call. You can also go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/meet, and that will take you directly to the scheduling page. Thank you so much for listening. We greatly appreciate it. Have a great rest of your week.